Okay, hello everyone. We are live. This is the sixth episode of DYOR, Do Your Own Research, the collaboration between the Defiant and the Initiative of Cryptocurrencies and Contracts, IC3, a group of outstanding researchers, of which we have three here today to join the panel. We'll be talking about crypto economics with, yes, some of the leading researchers and thinkers in that area. So I'll let the panelists introduce themselves and then we'll get straight to it. So maybe, Will, you can kick it off and then we'll go down.
Sure, Cami. Great pleasure to be here. My name is Wilson. I'm a finance and management professor at Cornell SC Johnson College of Business, and I'm also a affiliated research scientist at the IC3.
Hi, I'm Eswar Prasad. I'm a professor at Cornell University, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. I'm affiliated with IC3 as well, and I'm also the author of a book I wrote a couple of years ago called The Future of Money, How the Digital Revolution is Transforming Currencies and Finance.
Hi, everyone. Glad to be here. My name is Liao. I serve as the chief economist at Circle Internet Financials. And previously, I was the head of research at Newsroom Labs, and prior to that, I was an economist at the Federal Reserve Board.
Amazing. Really a pleasure and privilege to have you all here. And since we're discussing crypto economics, I thought it was a great opportunity to discuss a more timely development that's been happening and which I find pretty fascinating. We see these things from time and time again, these governance attacks in DeFi. The latest one happened on Compound Finance. A DeFi whale who goes by the name of Humpy pushed forward a proposal which would allocate almost 500,000 comp, or about $24 million, into a vault of a protocol that they control. The proposal was rejected twice. On the third time, they were able to push it forward, and then finally the issue got resolved because the team at Compound kind of negotiated with them and said, instead of doing this proposal, why don't we have 30% of the Compound revenue be distributed among comp stakers? And Humpy decided to agree to this, and so that was kind of the resolution, which appeared to be good for most of those involved, but it still leaves a question, which is, this external individual was able to push forward a proposal that benefited them directly, not necessarily the protocol, by amassing this large amount of tokens. Is this a sign of a broken DAO governance system, or is this how it should work? Like, I'm really interested to hear your takes here. Whoever wants to go first with this one.
Gordon, you want to go first?
Yeah, I can give my thoughts. Look, I think DAO governance is not so different from how traditional firms govern themselves through voters of shareholders, but instead it's voting through token holders. The one key difference is, of course, with DAO governance, the tokens are permissionless. So on the one side, as I would say, it's double-edged sword. You broaden the access, you broaden the ownership, and you lower the entry to barrier for voting and also proposing different proposals. But on the other side, maybe broadening it too much and having too low of a barrier to entry to propose new governance proposals that could potentially be harmful, especially if those who are proposing the governance proposals are not well identified and might have ulterior motives. This is not so different than, in the equity space, there are many firms that goes under very controversial votes, where there are also proxy fights, just like how some of those tokens are allocated to third parties to vote on. In the traditional finance space, oftentimes there's proxy voting. But it's all very typical in some sense. But what is different is just the clear lack of identification of who is involved, their motives. Usually, when there are very public fights in the public companies, you actually know it's usually like an activist investor that's acting on behalf of their own investor base. But in this case, it's actually not true. I would also say that in a trustless system, as it is in the blockchain space, the value of trust is even more important. That's why we have key opinion leaders in this industry that has large swings, because in some sense, like the value of actually having these known individuals come out and speak are even more valuable than in a world in which there is more trust.
So it's and Will, what do you think about this? Like, do you think that even if this might be very similar to what happens in the equity space, um, should we strive to maybe improve on the previous structure with something that maybe better aligns incentives so that the governance works for the protocol and can't be gained in favor of individual interests?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as Gordon was saying, this is not more broken than our traditional systems, right? In a way, we are introducing incentives relative to political voting, where you can't trade the voting rights very openly. And even in equity space, I think there is not a separate market. Whereas in the case of Compound, we do have Cong as a governance token that can be traded. And I think there are more creative designs people can introduce to deal with the governance issue. That being said, I don't think there is a clear direction or clear path, groundbreaking path at the moment. I chat with many founders of various networks, blockchain-based networks, and they all had this long-term goal. But in terms of the path leading there, I'm yet to see a very ingenious design. And you mentioned the gold camp proposal was cut off, but there's this new staking program that's introduced. In fact, in some of the ongoing studies we are conducting, you can show with the staking programs in the longer run, you actually lead to what is called a Pareto distribution of wealth and governance in the system, meaning there will be whales, there will be large players dominating the space. So I don't think that's a panacea for what's going on. It might work for temporarily kind of calm the market. But in general, this is open question that requires a lot of rigorous and careful research, in addition to the engineering kind of maneuvers that we see currently.
Oh, go ahead, Eswar. Looks like you
No,
want to
I
say
think Will and Gordon have hit upon the key issues, and it basically comes down to two things, which I think speaks to the broader issues at hand about how decentralized finance or decentralized autonomous organizations really are. Because the notion that we have, people power at play and that nobody can violate community standards of the interests of the community are preserved, I think is not entirely obvious, and you do have capture by a small set of key players, much like in traditional finance. And the second issue is that, again, these are exactly the issues that, as both Gordon and Will have pointed out, that traditional finance deals with what sort of governance structures you put in place in order to make sure that incentives are aligned clearly among the various stakeholders, both in the short run and the long run. And these are very complicated problems to sort through analytically. And the DAO was one way of hoping that we could make our way around these problems by essentially making sure that the community interest was always preserved. And what I think we are seeing with this latest incident is basically that we cannot quite leave it to these mechanisms. Now, whether we want to have new sorts of mechanisms layered on top of this decentralization is unclear, because we would like to maintain some of the benefits of decentralization. But I think it does point to some of these transitional risks, as Will pointed out. While we get to a better space, we're going to be stuck in the middle, where the existing systems don't work that well, and the new systems that we're trying to put in place have their own flaws.
If I
What
may
do you?
add just one more point about this transitional space that we currently reside. If you look at actually the largest token holders that should be actually voting very actively on DAOs, but they're not, are the set of large VC investors. They have huge amount of tokens that they, in a more traditional space, they would actually play an active role in voting. But currently, there are somewhat kind of prohibited from doing so because of rules are unclear about their basically whether they could vote and still treat the tokens as if they are utility tokens or commodities. So as a result, you actually see a lack of participation by some of the largest token holders that arguably have a strong financial incentive to vote, but for, I would say, somewhat of a distortion due to lack of regulation, you actually don't have them participating. So I think that in some ways, the current DAO structure are not being fully realized, in part due to the lack of clarity from the regulatory side that prevent a large set of token holders from voting.
That's an excellent point, and in fact, it's actually played out in this case, right? What do you think about potentially having two levels of tokens, similar to what happens in equities, where you have voting and non-voting shares? Could that help solve the issue, or is that not really feasible in crypto?
I mean, the good thing about crypto is that, DAO makes up its own rules, and one could, in principle, set up an efficient system. Now, first of all, one would need to think about exactly what that efficient system looks like. And, when you think about even the basic cryptocurrency ecosphere, the idea is that the large investors or large stakeholders or small stakeholders should all have their interests perfectly aligned in terms of preserving the value of that token, of that particular ecosystem. But we can see that in the short run, there are gains to be had by capture. Now, if we start imposing either through external regulations or various sorts of hierarchies, that at some level seems to go against the principle of decentralization. So I think we're really grappling with this issue right now. The proponents of DeFi would like a truly decentralized space, but we are learning that may not work that well given all the other inefficiencies that exist.
Yeah, and just to that point, right, from an economic perspective, I don't think we are decentralizing for the sake of decentralization. We're economists, we think about trade-offs. There are pros and cons to centralized designs versus decentralized designs. So what's likely to happen going forward is if someone can identify a nice combination of the elements, maybe we can make the system work better. Now more specifically to the dual token design, I think it's a clever engineering improvement to deal with some issues in the system. And that's what we've been seeing in the industry, right? We have engineering iterations that improve or solve certain problem. But what I think is missing is a holistic design perspective, right? What's the objective? What are the constraints? And what will be the best designs? And we don't see that because these are very hard economic questions. I don't think we have ready answers. We've been taking a brief engineering approach to it, but then we do realize over the time that there are certain systemic risks that we're introducing into the system. There are disclosure opaqueness issues that leads to frauds and manipulation in the market. So taking a step back, or at least thinking about the overall, mechanism design, information design of the system would be helpful. That would require collaborations, between our computer scientists, engineers, and economists.
Yeah, I second everything that Will and Eswar mentioned. Mechanism design is at the core of how crypto incentives and blockchain incentives function. Understanding that is just as important as understanding the infrastructure that's being built out. So on your specific question about the two token design, I think it could make a lot of sense to separate cash flows that are associated with the non-voting tokens versus the governance tokens that perhaps have more of a vote share. And this is, again, replication of what exactly occurs with dual share classes in traditional equity space. But I think it also, there needs to be much more careful studies of these because of the novel composability that are introduced, in which, you could presumably see the scenario in which there is, say, a lending platform in which you can borrow one token against the other that perhaps distort more of the incentive than what you normally would have.
So, looking at how DAO governance has played out so far, what do you think is improved by having this token governance system versus traditional equities? And what have been the challenges? So we've been talking about like the ways that these two systems are similar, but I think what excites everyone in this space is how can this system improve upon what's been done in the past. So is from what we've seen, what do you think that is?
So when I talk to DAO proponents, and I've spoken to quite a few, there is this idealistic sense that if you think about the traditional forms of trying to align incentives among all the stakeholders, you have some problems that emerge in the world of traditional finance, and then the regulators take some actions in order to prevent those from becoming a problem. Then you have new problems cropping up. But the DAO structure was seen as a way of starting from the bottom up, where essentially you start with a clean slate, try to get the entire community involved in creating not just the structure, but even the basic rules that are set in place. And so the community can think by itself about how to structure the incentives in a way that things are perfectly aligned among all the stakeholders. Now, that idealism, I think, is worth preserving, but once it gets into the hard realities of dealing with monetary issues in particular, then things go askew, and I think that is where we are in the development of DAO right now. Again, a great idea in principle, but once it gets into practice, things get a lot more complicated.
And just on the on the difference, right? We are talking about digital networks, so presumably it's a little bit easier, in theory, to vote or govern than having to send a letter to the company, right, to vote or delegate my vote. So presumably it's easier. I'm not sure if that's the case at the moment, just because many people are still not familiar with wallets and governance wallets. But that is one potential place where things can be made easier. But other than that, and maybe the transparent nature of many digital platforms help. You see a greater disclosure than traditional firms in some way. But other than these, I'm with Eswar on. We haven't made much progress. Kind of pushing the structure.
I think it's at least somewhat of a novel concept in pushing further on the boundary of the firm. If we think about traditional theories of the firm, why do firms exist? why don't we just all operate as individual contractors in the economy, and we can make contracts with each other, and for every single task or work project, we're doing it as an individual. But some of the economists very early on came up with theories about maybe there is efficiency gain because you're in a larger organization, maybe in part because there is less of principal agent type of frictions or information asymmetries, because you can solve it in a firm-like setting in which there are more hierarchy and more organization. I think there's a limit to how far decentralization could go. And if you think about theory of the firm more broadly, it is about decentralization. It's about how core do you want the decision to be made versus how decentralized you want it to be made, whether you want each individual to be a firm, right? And if you think about DAOs as a way of kind of removing some layers of information asymmetry by perhaps taking in, as Will mentioned, transparency nature of blockchain, verifiability of blockchain, you could potentially see an improvement in broadening the boundaries of the firm in terms of having more individualistic firms with a smaller group of people representing economic interests. But for that to realize, I think you had to actually use the on-chain information beyond just voting. You had to use the on-chain information for things like, for example, verifiability of actions, verifiability of payments. Those type of verifiability and observability of information, I think in some ways could lower the information asymmetry that are typical in terms of principal agent type of relationships. In that way, you could perhaps get to a more organized structure that is more decentralizing in a way. Because I think that still rests on the adoption of blockchain for almost everyday type of usage, which currently we are still in the process of fulfilling that dream.
So interesting to hear all of your thoughts on this, on saying on the one hand there's this potential for radical transparency in the way organizations work in a way that just hadn't been possible before, and that transparency should enable more participation and engagement of users, and just like the broader community around a protocol or platform, and because it's all digital, it should be very easy to vote. But what we're seeing in practice is that's not really being realized. In practice, DAO governance has very little participation. There's only a handful of people participating in these votes. People are just not interested. So I guess like final question on this topic is, what can be done to increase the level of engagement? There has been a lot of talk about DAO politicians. That's an interesting idea. People who are paid to vote, representing token holders. I think in the end it's all about incentives. If people are paid to do this as a job, then maybe token holders would be better represented, or maybe it's about a different governance structure, and it shouldn't be one token one vote. Maybe it should be one person one vote, but then that's a whole different kind of identity problem that we haven't really solved for. So very tough problem to solve, but what do you think can be done to increase participation?
Yeah. I'll give a step on that. I think there are really two layers to the discussion. One layer is that a technical possibility, right? And I think we've made great progress along that dimension. And the second layer is that an economic reality? Are people incentivized to behave in a way? Or even when they are incentivized to behave in a way, do they end up behaving that way? That relates very much to what we were talking about, on design, on all these incentive provision. I would just say, we need more research. We need to learn from what we already know from economic studies, from the long history of central bankers thinking about stability of systems, stability of currencies, from political science about vote buying, about quadratic votes, right? How to price these things. I think there's a lot that we can learn from and innovate upon, and that is yet to be fully explored. So far, we've been exploring the engineering possibilities on the technical side, and I really think that's a very promising direction to explore further.
So to build on Will's idea of borrowing from other disciplines, maybe we should borrow from political science as well. When people don't vote in elections, one explanation is they don't care. The other is they feel that their vote is not going to matter because there are other forces at play. So here there is a question about whether the small stakeholders feel that either they are not going to have their voices really heard, or they don't care. Maybe we should adopt the Australian model of getting people to pay a small penalty if you don't get out there and vote. So if each relevant wallet or stakeholder in the system gets a little penalty if they don't vote, maybe we'll at least get better participation. Whether that will necessarily translate into better outcomes, going back to points that both Will and Gordon have made, not obvious.
Yeah, I think those are great points. And I would also add just learning from the current existing structure for corporates, right? Having delegated management where decisions not every single small decision had to go through a vote. Rather, there's some set of decisions that you just delegate to the manager to decide. Having a board, perhaps similarly in the DAO structure, having a board of observers, a board of directors that are also responsible for making sure that the managers are doing their job. I think those are, in some ways rebuilding what we already have in the corporate space. But I think there is quite a bit of improvements one could make because you could add on various additional features on blockchain, various additional transparency and observability aspects that are directly building on the blockchain. So I would almost start from what currently is the structure that might not be functioning perfectly, but still is somewhat working, and build from there rather than completely building from scratch and kind of learning along the way all the prior mistakes that as a society we have already learned, either because political scientists would study these issues, voting, or from a corporate finance perspective, people have looked at these similar type of issues.
And just adding on to what Gordon just mentioned about corporate finance and all that, right? Even when we think about crypto asset valuation, right? Digital asset valuation, it's really a combination of what we know in asset pricing, corporate finance, and monetary economics. Think about a platform, a digital network. When they introduce their own tokens, they are adjusting token supply, just like leaders of central government, central banks in the country is designing their monetary policy, right? But at the same time, the platform, the digital network, is very similar to how a firm would operate. You have to design incentives to have people participate. You have to decide where to close a program and where to open a new staking program. And that's very much corporate finance decisions. And then you're dealing with these new digital assets. That's very much asset pricing. But it's really all these elements combined. When a firm hold, let's say, treasury bonds or cash, right, to improve their operation, flexibility and all that, and slack, they don't get to price these assets. But here, when you design the monetary supply of tokens, you're pricing these assets at the same time as you use them as liquid instruments. And at the same time, there's a secondary market where people are kind of exerting forces to pin down the returns for these assets. So I think it's very fascinating from a research perspective. And in turn, the research should yield useful insights for practitioners, for designs of these platforms.
Awesome. Yeah, no, and that I'm glad you mentioned this because that's exactly where I wanted to go next. Talking about how projects and teams should design, or what should they consider when they are designing their tokenomics? Like what factors should go into their models?
So I think on this panel, Will has the honor of being the originator of the term tokenomics, so perhaps we should hear from him first.
Happy to offer my 2 cents. So, I mean, I think number one, we should realize that tokens are not all created equal. They are not all the same. There are finer categories within tokens. Some are used more as a general payment, money-like instruments. Some are more associated with platforms. Some are just digitization of cash flows, and we can use our discounted cash flow to think about their valuation. And others are entitlement to ownership, digital ownership, to arts, to collectibles, and NFTs will be in that category. And the valuation and the way we think about tokenomics will be all very different. I do think in the macro aspect, monetary aspect, many of the projects and the books that Eswar and Gordon have been working on would add to that discussion very much. But for a practitioner, for an engineer who's designing the token supply, I think some basic elements to realize and consider is, number one, unlike currency in a country whose adoption is not fluctuating all the time, right? There are this number of people living in the country. That number doesn't fluctuate, in large percentages. Whereas for a digital platform, adoption is really endogenous, right? So that's playing a role, and you have to think about the local incentive provision for certain programs versus the aggregate monetary supply. They do interact very strongly. And at the same time, in the end, these are still supply and demand driven, right? Especially for tokens that don't explicitly give you a stream of cash flows. How do we think about valuing them? From the supply side, you have this monetary policy that the token issuer is introducing. And I do think in the industry, in practice, people have good intuitions, right, on controlling for, limiting inflation or setting a hard cap, so on and so forth. But those are a bit ad hoc, right? Why do we set the hard cap at this level, right? And that's where, again, we can learn from what central banks have been trying to do, right? Maybe doing a bit more than them, maybe committing a bit more to the policy, right, in some way. But there are ways to take so-called inflationary versus deflationary actions, so on and so forth, to stimulate the economy and also to control inflation, things like that. From the demand side, I actually think education is important. When people actually understand what these platforms and crypto assets are about, on top of speculative actions or trading, right? They actually realize they serve certain functionality in the economy, in the virtual economy, and also in connection with the real economy. Then we can gradually converge to more, fundamental-driven demand versus just pure sentiment speculation, which could fluctuate a lot, as we see in many speculative assets. I'm sure both of my fellow panelists have more to add.
I think Will laid out a good framing up front that not all tokens are the same. Not all the tokens are created equal. There are very distinct categories. In my mind, it's probably, I would say there are 3 categories of tokens. The first category are those are linked to real world values. So stablecoin being one of those type of tokens, but also a broader set of real world asset tokenization projects. The second set, I would say, are more commodity focused. So Bitcoin clearly is considered a commodity, Ethereum as well now, given the newer SEC type of definition. And then the third kind are more general, you could call it utility token or governance token of different sorts. So I would completely separate out the three in their use case, as well as the supply and demand aspect. So for the first kind, the tokens are representing real world asset values. I say that's more of a digital representation of what existing values are. So for instance, Circles issues USDC, which we consider as a digital form of dollar that is backed entirely by dollar-based asset, short-term, highly liquid asset, but also is just an on-chain representation of the dollar that could be used, transacted instantaneously, that could be used cross-border. So it inherits certain features from the blockchain space, especially on the programmability side, but it doesn't, Circle is not setting independent monetary policy. Circle is not setting emissions of USDC. So that's quite divorced from the typical type of tokenomics that are associated with individual projects. Similarly, if you're tokenizing, say, treasury bonds and equities even, those type of tokens are just simply deriving values from the underlying value that are custodied elsewhere. But I think those are still very important projects because it's not just opening up access and opening up instant settlement, but you're also opening up the ability to engage with smart contracts, to have programmability, to have exchanges that are deployed on chain. The second type of token I would say is more just considered as commodities. That's like Bitcoin or Ethereum, and that's probably more of a investment purpose. Recently, I actually just released a paper on what drives crypto asset prices. That's more focused on the second category of Bitcoin-like or Ethereum-like commodity type of tokens. And their supply and demand, really follows the supply and demand of commodities that have similar type of value. So Bitcoin, you could say that it serves somewhat as a inflationary hedge, and it has its own kind of tokenomics because it is trying to address a certain concern with inflation in some ways. And Ethereum has additional features related to more of the development aspect. But I say those are also quite separate from the other two categories. The last category is the most novel, most innovative. You have all sorts of different schedules of emissions of tokens and different type of, say, coupon payments of equivalent. I say that's much more of where there's, earlier tying the earlier discussion of governance, right? Where you could actually try out and experiment different type of incentive designs to see whether you can get a broader ecosystem, to also see whether you can get better governance outcome. And I think that's a very fruitful area of continued innovation. But we also had to be aware that it's still quite early in that discovery process, and there is no clear model of what works best yet. And that's a very exciting field to be in, to figure out what is the right tokenomics for that third category of tokens that has utility functions or governance functions.
Absolutely. Eswar, I'd love for if you could focus on that third category after Will and Gordon laid out the framework for the different types of tokens so well. But yeah, this third one is kind of the bigger question mark on how should they be structured and designed. And I wonder if they should be thought of as, in order to just frame the design decisions, should these tokens be thought of similar to equities, or can they also be like native currencies of the protocols? Because like early on in crypto, like in the ICO era, that's how they were thought of, right? Like the utility tokens were usually used as a way to pay for goods and services in a protocol like DentaCoin. I don't know, as an example. Those were kind of the very basic tokenomic designs back then. But I think the ecosystem has evolved and become more complex. And now protocol native tokens look more like like equities than like uh, than tokens like that payment currencies inside of a protocol. Do you think that's right, that right now these tokens should be thought of more as equities, or is still room for different types of tokens, including utility tokens, or like what's kind of the latest thinking in this third bucket?
It's hard for me to add to what Will and Gordon laid out so comprehensively in terms of analytical frameworks. So as one thinks about some aspects of tokenomics that are already touched upon, like valuation of tokens, it's worth thinking about what the underlying valuation model is that we could use. So I would use an additional layer in terms of thinking about tokens in terms of what functions they are accomplishing. One could be just in terms of increasing efficiency. So if you think about stable coins, for instance, they're giving us more efficient ways of conducting digital payments, either within traditional conduits or in the new conduits of decentralized finance. Then there is the aspect of removing problems or obstacles. There are certain tokens that help us get around inefficiencies in the and not just inefficiencies, but problems in the existing financial system. So that is a second issue. And then the third is thinking about tokens that allow us to do things that could not be done before. And that's where I think the transformative aspect of crypto and blockchain technology comes in. If you think about smart contracts or even other basic transactions without using financial intermediaries, that is in a sense a new way of conducting business altogether. If you think about NFTs, those were not possible before we had blockchain technology, because you could not guarantee unique ownership of a digital instrument. So I think as we reflect on the valuation of tokens, ultimately it's going to come down to what the utility of those tokens is on these three dimensions: efficiency, getting around problems, and enabling new forms of finance or new forms of transactions. And when we think about equities, we have a clear way of thinking about the value of an equity as being the present discounted value of future earning streams of a firm. So with tokens, I think this sort of work that Will and Gordon are doing is really important in terms of giving us good analytical frameworks of thinking about how to value tokens. The notion of Bitcoin getting a lot of value basically from scarcity, I think, is not really by itself a durable source of value. The question is, what utility is it providing? And that's what I think we should be focusing on.
And if I may just add to what Eswar was saying, and I think, Camille, you actually pointed out in the question you asked, the tokens are really hybrid assets in some way. They serve some functionality of money, right, being used in that digital ecosystem. But at the same time, it's tied to the digital network, whatever functionality that network is providing. So nailing down that fundamental value is important. Just like a country's currency, strength of currency should be tied to its GDP, to its military strength, financial strength, economic strength, things like that. And here, even though we're in a virtual world, we're talking about almost like virtual nations, it should be very similar. And if we are looking for a very concrete piece of advice in terms of token issuance, I can give a quick description there, right? So it's important to measure the ratio of token supply, the tokens that are out there circulating, to some metric of efficiency and activity in the digital economy, on the platform, right? Let's say it's data storage or decentralized computing, how efficient they are. You should have some measure of the vibrancy of the economy there. And looking at that ratio, if its tokens are oversupplied, as a designer, you should buy back tokens and burn them at some threshold. If they are undersupplied, you should issue some more tokens to compensate people, to stimulate the economy, to even compensate the founders of the platform. And that's essentially a form of monetary policy that we've seen used in central banks from time to time as well. But here you can combine that with more corporate decisions and more fundamental metrics of the blockchain platform that we're looking at.
What do you guys think about using incentives and rewards, like we're seeing with airdrops and these point systems and so on, to incentivize that activity that you're talking about, Will?
I think these are, in essence, right? When we talk about, say, airdrops, what are we doing? We're typically increasing token circulation, right? And allocating to a particular group of people, sometimes a randomized group of people. So these are redistributive monetary policies. So I think they make some sense in many cases. But again, the approach so far we've taken is very ad hoc, right? Oh, we think allocating some tokens would incentivize users on board. But how does that affect the aggregate token supply and the monetary system and token valuation in the system? I don't think people have systematically understood that aspect, and that's where we can relate to more research, more economics research. That would be very informative.
I think these rewards and incentives are being airdropped or compensated are, in some ways not too new, right? The best reward system, in my opinion, just all time, it's not airline miles, it's not token rewards, it's the network effect that's created by the interchange system. So what is the interchange system? That is the Visa and MasterCard network in which the merchants essentially had to pay above market for the cost of transactions, and part of it get rebated to the users. That's where you get your credit card rewards from. And why does it work? It's because I think the early pioneers in that incentive design industry have figured out that merchants are much less elastic in their demand for payment services because they just want goods to be sold than the users. The users are super sensitive to rewards. They want to earn the extra credit card miles, the extra rewards. So that incentive system was built probably 20, 30, 40 years ago and still endures today to be the largest incentive network. So I think there are really good examples in which incentives, when done right, when you figured out what is the right trigger, what is the right incentive alignment, to really bootstrap a network that lasts a long time. Now, have we figured out with airdrops? Probably not, because oftentimes what you see is there are airdrop farmers that come in that kind of farms things away. But I think there's a lot of learnings, again, going back to the earlier point that we all made. There are learnings to be made of what has worked in traditional finance, in other areas that I think tokenomic designers should also think about.
As we close, I'd love kind of your thoughts on the biggest lessons so far in terms of tokenomics. We've talked about how hard it's been for DAO governance to work, how airdrops and rewards haven't really been exactly figured out yet in crypto. So yeah, what kind of important lessons have we learned so far that engineers and founders can apply in the future?
Happy to give a
Mhm.
first step on that as well. And this is actually related to your last question, Cam. How to provide the right incentives, right, to get people on board, to make the industry evolve in a desirable direction. I think I cannot overemphasize the role of careful, rigorous research and education in that aspect. So I'm not sure what I'm saying is the biggest lesson, but I think it's an important lesson that we need to pay more attention to, especially on the dark side of crypto in some way, right? In order for the sector to evolve in a healthy way, we have to get rid of the fraudsters, we have to get rid of the manipulations, right? All these issues. And if we look at what happened in the past, right, be it the collapse of Terra Luna in May 2022, or FTX implosion and all that, actually in some of our earlier research, we point out that vertical integration without disclosure could lead to concentration of market power. It could lead to market manipulation, such as was trading, right? That's what Binance was sued for, and Coinbase for a little bit. And had we taken these lessons more seriously, we could have prevented many of these issues. And recently, I saw a paper on crypto-enabled pig butchering, right? Large-scale scams, enabled by cryptos. If we can educate people on these issues, we can get rid of these dark elements in the space, and with greater regulatory certainty, which so far would be lacking. I think these could help with adoption and growth in the industry, in addition to the economic incentive design part, right, and the technical engineering aspect.
So blockchain technology and decentralization have enormous potential, but we can't leave it just to them to come up with the solutions, as both Will and Gordon have pointed out, that can take us down very dangerous and dark paths. So we need the right sort of regulatory guidelines that enable us to deal with some of the less or the more unsavory elements of crypto while harnessing the benefits. But this is also a good occasion to put in a plug for IC3, because I think what really is necessary to solve some of these problems is engineers, computer scientists, cryptographers, and economists and finance people like ourselves, trying to collectively solve these problems. So I think IC3 and the sort of initiatives along those lines are going to be very important in terms of designing a better decentralized architecture that is more robust and that works well for everyone.
I'll summarize my takeaway, which is when trust is scarce, trust is even more important. That's why we turn to trusted source, from key industry leaders, as well as journalism and also verifiability of different sorts to obtain that trust. I think in this industry in particular, trust is so important, so core, even though the whole industry is built around removing trust.
Yeah, really a fascinating discussion. Thanks to all the panelists. I think, we are rebuilding this financial ecosystem with crypto from scratch. But I think one of the insights here is that we should look to other disciplines. In the case, this case we talked about corporate finance. There has been so much work done there that we should build on top of that, and not completely scrap the foundations that have been laid out. We also talked about how regulatory clarity will be key, obviously, in making the adoption grow further in crypto. And just how much work still needs to be done in token design, crypto economics, governance, and how researchers like here in the panel, journalists and journalism like we're producing at the Defiant, it will be key in continuing to refine and improve these systems. So thank you again for joining me, and thanks to all the listeners who hopped on, and see you at the next one. Thanks again.
Thank you, Cami, for having us here.
Thank
Good
you.
to see you, Eswar and Gordon. Take care.
Thank you all.
Bye.